Thanksgiving at my parents' house always followed the same script. The same dishes, the same playlist of instrumental jazz humming in the background, the same carefully arranged dining room with a table long enough to host more pride than people. I showed up 15 minutes early like always. Callum showed up 20 minutes late like always. Somehow he was still the one who got applause. He made his entrance in a camel-colored coat designer boots, barely touched by the November slush, outside a bottle of wine in one hand and that self-assured smirk in the other. Mom rushed to greet him, air-kissing his cheeks, like he'd just flown in from Paris, not driven 20 minutes across town in his leased Mercedes. "There's our rising star," she said, wrapping him in a side hug. "Rowan's here too," she added as an afterthought, nodding toward me. Dinner started the way it always did, with stories about Callum's latest promotion, his client meetings, the ski resort he'd just returned from. Dad raised a glass to him before the turkey was even carved. "To our boy, Callum, Vice President of Strategic Messaging. Not bad for 34, huh?" Everyone clinked glasses. I took a quiet sip of water. Then, as if on cue, the conversation circled back to me. Or rather, it was handed off like a soft target. So Rowan Callum said, leaning back in his chair voice, just loud enough for the cousins to tune in. "Still wrenching away in that garage of yours, I kept my eyes on my plate. I run a fabrication business, yeah." He chuckled. "Right the garage job. Building monster trucks for doomsday preppers. Must be a real cash cow." A few people laughed. My dad actually snorted. "Maybe Callum can get you into the marketing department," he said. "You know when you're ready to hang up the oil rag." My mom smiled tightly, lifting her wine. "To both our boys, one suit's up, one suit's down." Glasses clinked again. No one noticed I didn't raise mine. I glanced around the table and felt the familiar chill, the kind that doesn't come from weather, but from absence. I could have said something. I could have reminded them of the military contracts, the 3 facilities, the team of 50 behind me. But that would have meant I was still waiting for their approval. Instead, I swallowed my pride with the mashed potatoes and passed the gravy to Callum, just like always. But this time, something in me finally shifted. Callum and I shared a birthday a face and not much else. Even when we were little, the lines were already forming. He was the one who made friends easily, who smiled for cameras and teachers alike. I was the quiet kid who preferred taking apart the toaster just to see if I could put it back together better. By the time we hit middle school, he was the one getting picked first in gym class while I was sketching gear systems in the margins of my math notebook. Mom hung his soccer trophies above the fireplace. My drawings stayed in my backpack. When Callum won student council president in 9th grade, they threw a dinner party. When I rebuilt my first carburetor at 14, I walked into the living room holding it like a trophy. "Look what I made," I said. They were watching Callum's highlight reel from Friday night's game for the 3rd time. "That's nice, honey," Mom said, not looking away from the screen. Dad glanced at the carburetor, then back at the carpet. "Don't get grease on the rug." I stood there for a second longer than I should have, waiting for something, anything. Then I turned around and went back to the garage. It never really changed after that. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering was some version of the same conversation. When was I going to apply myself? When was I going to stop playing around with tools and get a real job? Callum always offered his suggestions condescending in that friendly, polished way of his. "It's not too late to get into marketing," he said once. Or maybe logistics. "You're good with tools that has to translate somehow." Even the compliments were cuts. Over time, I learned to nod, to thank them, to smile like I was taking their advice to heart. But underneath, I was already building something far beyond their expectations. They just didn't know where to look. And when I met Wes, the first person who actually saw the value in what I was creating, everything started to change. Wes Corbin walked into my life like he already knew where it was going. We met at a local fabrication workshop. He was teaching a crash course on field welding, and I was the only guy in the room taking notes with grease on his hands. He'd served in the Marines for 10 years, worked in every climate from desert heat to Arctic cold, and had a mind built for solving problems fast. We bonded over bad coffee and better ideas. A month later, we signed the lease on a collapsing barn outside Spokane. It had a leaky roof, uneven floors, and just enough power to run a welder if you didn't also need lights. We didn't care. It was ours. We called it ForgeWorks Tactical, more hope than business at that point. Those first 2 years nearly broke us. I sold my truck to buy our first plasma cutter. Wes cashed out what was left of his discharge pay. We lived in the loft above the barn, sleeping on military cots with space heaters humming like lullabies. Ramen, bulk rice, and instant coffee became our food pyramid. Our credit cards groaned under the weight of CNC orders and steel shipments, but we kept building. The breakthrough came late one night during a snowstorm. We'd been sketching a modular rack system that could shift between overland camping and tactical response modes, same base, different gear, tool, less reconfiguration. Nothing out there did both well. We prototyped in 2 weeks and tested it in 3 feet of snow, pulling our demo truck up a frozen incline with a full load strapped down. It didn't budge. We posted photos and specs on a few off-road forums. 3 days later, we got an inquiry from a search and rescue team in Utah, then a sheriff's department in Arizona, then a small military contractor. None of them cared that our office had hay bales stacked in the corner. They just cared that the gear worked when it had to. Every time we got a new order, I wanted to tell my parents, but I didn't. Not because I was hiding, because I'd already learned they weren't looking. Instead, I called Wes and told him we were going to need a second welder. By our 3rd year, ForgeWorks wasn't just surviving, it was gaining real ground. We moved into a proper facility, hired a handful of full-time fabricators, and locked down our biggest deal, yet a $1. $8 million contract with the Department of Homeland Security for a fleet of specialized Border Patrol vehicles. We beat out 3 much larger companies because our systems were modular, adaptable, and field-tested under real conditions. The night we got confirmation, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called home. Mom answered on the 2nd ring. I told her the news straight. We'd landed a government contract. I expected a pause, a breath, maybe a flicker of pride. What I got was, "Oh, that's nice, honey. Did I tell you Callum's been nominated for a national marketing award? He's being flown out to Chicago next week, 5-star hotel and everything." I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, hearing her go on about the award. The suit he was having tailored the speech he was rehearsing. When she finally asked if I was coming to Sunday dinner, I said I'd be working. It wasn't a lie. At the next family gathering I did attend, Callum held court at the center of the room. Everyone leaned in as he told stories about product launches and strategy meetings, tossing out buzzwords like he was pitching to shareholders. When someone asked what I was up to, I just said we were busy in the shop. No one followed up. It was easier that way. But irony has a long memory. Not long after, a quiet email showed up in the ForgeWorks inbox from an engineer at Stratoline Motors, Callum's company. He'd seen our gear at a defense expo and wanted to talk about integrating our components into a new off-road luxury line. I didn't say a word to Wes about Callum's connection. I didn't mention it to my parents. I just sat back and watched the partnership unfold. Months later, their top-tier Falcon package hit the market. Press releases praised its rugged innovation and military-grade components. Callum called it a game-changer in interviews. He didn't know it, but he was bragging about us. The only time Callum ever stepped foot in ForgeWorks was a Thursday afternoon in late spring. He didn't call ahead. Just pulled up in his spotless SUV, stepped out in pressed slacks and a white button-down, and walked through our shop like he'd taken a wrong turn into a junkyard. I was in the middle of a durability test, running one of our new suspension systems through its paces on the press rig. Metal shrieked as pressure built the shop echoing with machine noise and shouted measurements. Callum stood at the edge of the chaos, nose wrinkled. So he said, scanning the space like it offended him, "This is the operation." Wes looked up from the plasma cutter, raised an eyebrow, then went back to work. I wiped my hands on a rag and nodded. "Yeah, this is it. It's quaint," he said, stepping gingerly around a puddle of coolant. "You and what a couple of guys patching up old Jeep's 15 guys," I said. "Give or take." He laughed like I'd made a joke. 15 for a garage shop, ambitious. Then he clapped me on the shoulder. "If you ever want something more stable, I might be able to get you in with our maintenance crew. Real paycheck benefits, clean floors." Behind him, Wes looked over with a grin that he didn't bother to hide. Callum didn't notice the Falcon suspension unit we were refining. Didn't recognize the communication rig we'd just delivered to Stratoline's prototype division. He didn't even ask. He stayed 10 minutes, said we should grab a beer sometime, and walked out the same way he came in, convinced of what he already believed. Wes turned to me, still smiling. "He really doesn't know, does he?" I shook my head. "Not a clue. I wasn't supposed to be at the Stratoline event. Wes was scheduled to attend, but he came down with the flu 2 days before. You'll be fine, he told me over the phone, his voice hoarse. Just shake a few hands, nod a lot. Don't wear your shop boots. I wore them anyway. The gala was held in one of those rented conference ballrooms with beige carpeting, floor-to-ceiling banners, and enough empty flattery to choke a room full of executives. I kept to the edge, nodding through small talk with engineers and vendors, nursing a soda while everyone else sipped champagne. I hadn't seen Callum yet, and I wasn't looking. But he found me. "Mason," he said behind me, voice wrapped in disbelief and amusement. "What the hell are you doing here?" I turned around slowly. "Evening, Callum. You got an invite to this." He laughed and scanned my boots. "Did they mistake you for a catering guy?" Before I could answer, a voice interrupted. "Wait, Mason, Blackwell, from ForgeWorks." It was Stratoline's head of product development. He looked from me to Callum, then back again. "This is the guy behind the Falcon package. Your team's been working with him for months." Callum blinked, like the air had been sucked out of the room. "That's not—" "No. This is my brother. He runs some hobby shop." "Mason's company built the entire off-road line," the product lead said. "They're our biggest innovation partner. He's the reason this campaign is even happening." A few nearby execs turned toward us, catching pieces of the exchange. Someone murmured my name. Another clapped me on the back. Callum's face was frozen, half smile, half horror, as if someone had unplugged him mid-performance. "No," he said louder now. "This has to be a mistake. My brother builds backyard toys. He doesn't run this." More people gathered. An executive VP stepped forward. "Mason's firm pulled in $28 million last year. We've been trying to get him to one of these events for ages." Callum's voice cracked. "You've got to be kidding me." But no one was. The room had already shifted. I didn't say much. I didn't have to. I stood still while the applause swelled, and Callum stood surrounded by the sound of everything he thought he knew, unraveling. When I finally walked out of the ballroom, I didn't look back. The next morning, my phone lit up with missed calls. 15 from Callum. 23 messages. I didn't open a single one. I had already made my decision. By the time I got back to Spokane, my phone looked like a panic button. Callum had left voicemails, texts, even voice memos, each more erratic than the last. The first few were pure denial. You blindsided me. This isn't funny. Then came the guilt. You could have told me. We're brothers. Eventually, desperation seeped in. We need to talk. I need your help. Somewhere around message 25, he tried sincerity. I've always believed in you. I was just pushing you to grow. He had no idea how many years too late that line was. Then the rest of the family started chiming in. Mom called crying. Dad left a long voicemail using words like overreaction and family comes first. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted to get coffee. I didn't respond to any of them. For a day, I did nothing, just let the messages pile up and stared at my inbox like it might make the decision for me. Part of me wondered if cutting the contract was petty. Callum had already embarrassed himself. Maybe that should have been enough. But then I thought about all the years he dismissed me, all the dinners I spent being treated like a cautionary tale. I thought about him mocking my work while his company sold it for profit. I thought about how he never once asked what I was building, not even when he stood in the middle of it. Am I punishing him? I asked myself, or finally freeing myself, I opened my laptop. By noon, the next day, our legal team had drafted the notice terminating our agreement with Stratoline Motors effective immediately. I reviewed the document, made a few edits, and clicked send. I added a short note, appreciate the opportunity, wishing your team continued success. I copied their CEO. Then I scrolled to Callum's contact, hit delete, and went back to the shop. That evening, Wes handed me a fresh design schematic and we started talking expansion plans. Neither of us mentioned the contract again. We didn't need to. We'd already cleared the space. By the end of the week, every major industry blog had picked up the story. The headlines were subtle but sharp. ForgeWorks terminates 9.4 mates, partnership amid strategic shift. The subtext wasn't. Stratoline stock dipped. Analysts speculated about supplier instability, loss of premium features, and internal mismanagement. I didn't say a word publicly. I didn't need to. 2 days later, someone forwarded me a leaked company memo. Callum had been reassigned, officially transitioned into a supportive operations role. Unofficially, he was managing digital updates for service manuals in a windowless office next to the copy machines. They stripped him of his title, his budget, his team. Still, the phone kept ringing. Mom called again and again. I ignored her for 3 days before I finally picked up. She was already crying when I said hello. Why would you do this to your brother? She asked, like the contract had been some family heirloom I shattered out of spite. I let her talk. When she paused to breathe, I said only, you should come see the shop. She showed up the next morning. The security guard buzzed her in. I watched her step inside, looking around like she'd just wandered into a foreign country. Machines lined the walls. Welders sparked in the background. Framed photos of our finished builds, military SAR expedition-grade rigs covered the front wall. She walked slowly, taking it all in. I didn't know, she said softly. You didn't ask, I replied. She turned to me, eyes wet. Why didn't you ever tell us I wasn't hiding? I said. You just never looked. She nodded, swallowed hard, and left without saying much more. I didn't stop her. That night I stayed late in the shop running diagnostics on a suspension rig we were testing for a new armored client. Wes had already gone home. The place was quiet, steady. For the first time in years, I felt like the ground beneath me wasn't shifting anymore. The next morning, a certified letter arrived at the front desk, this time addressed directly to me. The envelope was thick, the kind that smells like cologne and desperation. Inside was a letter from Callum's lawyer, written in formal language but soaked in entitlement. He claimed the termination of our contract had wrecked his professional standing and personal finances, that as his brother and the beneficiary of a shared family upbringing, I had a moral obligation to offer support. I slid the letter across my desk to our counsel. He skimmed it, set it down, and without missing a beat, said, "I'll draft a reply, get a real job." That same afternoon, the guilt parade arrived in full. My aunt called, then my father, then 2 cousins I hadn't heard from in years. Everyone had something to say about forgiveness, about loyalty, about being the bigger person. I let them talk. Then I told them the same thing I'd told myself 100 times. No, I didn't burn any bridges. I just stopped walking toward them. Later that week, I blocked every number still trying to reach me. The silence wasn't cold. It was clean, final. And in that quiet, I returned to the work, the machines, the team, the future we were still building. The numbers on the report didn't surprise me anymore, but I still paused to take them in. ForgeWorks had just passed $75 million in annual revenue, 5 facilities, 200 employees, government contracts, private clients, partnerships I'd once only dreamed about when I was sleeping on a cot under a leaky barn roof. But what mattered most wasn't on any spreadsheet. We'd just broken ground on a new 5-acre headquarters built from the ground up with the kind of space we never had in those early days. The design included a testing ground, 2 machine bays, and a classroom. That last part was my favorite. It was for the foundation we'd started offering training and apprenticeships to veterans and scholarships for under-resourced kids who wanted to get into fabrication engineering or just working with their hands. Wes and I took turns mentoring. Some days I'd find myself elbow-deep in a suspension rebuild with a 19-year-old who reminded me of myself, quiet, steady, already used to being underestimated. I didn't need to inspire him. I just had to show up. And for the first time in my life, I breathed easy. I spent weekends working on my '78 Bronco again, no deadlines, no pressure. Just wrenching in the quiet music, playing low hands, stained with grease, for no one's approval, but my own. That was where I felt most myself still. That was where I remembered why I started. My old life doesn't haunt me. It just doesn't belong to me anymore. I didn't lose a family. I let go of a version of myself that kept asking them to see me. I stopped auditioning for their pride. Somewhere along the way, I realized they hadn't rejected me. They'd just never really known who I was. They called it a garage. But now that garage builds futures, and not just mine. Some bridges don't need rebuilding. Some names don't need clearing. Some stories just need closing. Success doesn't reveal who you are. It reveals who everyone else really was. So when they laugh at you over dinner, ask yourself who's really at the table with you, and more importantly, who built the table in the first place.